Seguimos con el tema las ciencias naturales y la fe religiosa, una propuesta para una cosmovisión integrada. La moderadora de esta sesión será Sofía Salas, médico cirujano de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile e investigadora del Centro de Bioética de la Universidad del Desarrollo. Adelante, Sofía.
Muy buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Es para mí, obviamente, un honor moderar este panel sobre las ciencias naturales y la fe religiosa. Una propuesta para una cosmovisión integrada. Se me había pedido como deferencia a nuestro invitado internacional que hiciera la moderación en inglés, pero dado de que él no va a poder estar siguiendo esta conferencia, me ha parecido más fácil hacerlo en español. El primer invitado es el profesor Alister McGrath de la Universidad de Oxford, quien hará su presentación mediante un video, puesto que por problemas de salud no pudo viajar. El profesor McGrath es químico especializado en teoría cuántica, quien luego cambió su enfoque hacia la teología. Es autor de numerosos libros, el más reciente, Natural Philosophy on Retrieving a Lost Disciplinary Imaginary, fue publicado el año pasado. Voy a presentar ahora a los comentaristas, vamos a ver el video y luego haré pasar a los panelistas. El querido amigo y colega, el profesor Rafael Vicuña, es bioquímico, tiene un doctorado en biología molecular en el Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Es profesor titular de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, donde ha sido vicerrector académico y decano de la Facultad de Ciencias Biológicas. Es miembro de número de la Academia Chilena de Ciencias, de la World Academy of Science, de la Academia Pontificia de Ciencias y del Dicasterio Pontificio de la Cultura y la Educación, entre otras sociedades científicas. Es autor de más de 100 publicaciones científicas en el campo de la enzimología y expresión de genomas de hongos y bacterias, para luego seguir nutriéndonos con más de 60 publicaciones relativas a ciencia y sociedad, y ha tenido un indudable interés en temas de ciencia y religión. El segundo comentarista es el profesor Héctor Velázquez, que es doctor en filosofía por la Universidad de Navarra. Ha sido profesor de filosofía en la naturaleza y filosofía de la ciencia por más de 30 años y su investigación actual se centra en el impacto y desafíos éticos de la ciencia y la tecnología en la sociedad, así como en el diálogo interdisciplinar y las relaciones entre ciencia, filosofía y religión. Tiene numerosas publicaciones académicas y en el último tiempo también han incursionado en temas de transhumanismo y actualmente tenemos el agrado de tenerlo como investigador del Observatorio de Bioética del Instituto de Ciencia e Innovación de Medicina de esta universidad. Vamos a dejarlo a ustedes con el video que me imagino que va a aparecer en la pantalla.
My name's Alister McGrath, and I'm delighted to be with you at this conference, even though in a rather virtual way. But it is such a pleasure to be with you. I used to be a scientist. I studied quantum theory at Oxford University and then went on to do my doctorate in molecular biophysics, but then switched to the whole area of theology, finding that very, very interesting. And in many ways, my intellectual career has been about building bridges between science and religion, or science and the humanities, because I find this really, really interesting. So I was delighted to be asked to speak to you about this topic for this conference. So here is what we're going to be talking about in this very interesting session. I'm going to begin by opening up some very interesting questions, which are to do with the general interaction of science and faith. So I think this is a very interesting topic, and what I want to do is to try and explore this question, trying to anticipate 3 questions that you might have about this general topic. And I think the first question that someone would want to ask is very simply this: why would anybody want to develop an integrated worldview? Why would anybody want to try to build bridges across intellectual disciplines such as the natural sciences and religion, or indeed the natural sciences and the humanities? That's a very good question. So we'll be looking at that very early on. But then, having decided this might be an okay or a good thing to do, we then have the question of how we actually go about doing this. And so in many ways, the main section of this lecture is ways in which we can build bridges, ways in which we can use intellectual models or imaginative schemes to try and hold together different disciplines, above all, of course, the natural sciences and religion. And then, of course, a very important question, which is this: what benefits result? In other words, if we do this, what are the things that we take away from this that we might find both helpful and positive? So that basically is the agenda that we are setting for this discussion. So we're going to begin by exploring the first of these questions, which is this: why would anybody want to try and build bridges between science and the humanities, or science and religion, as we're looking specifically in this lecture? So I think there are three answers I can give to this. First of all, there are a lot of people who are interested in this question. In other words, while not everyone will say this is something that excites me or interests me, there will be many who will say this is a very important conversation and it affects me. Personally, I think it's interesting for everybody, but I can see that it's intellectually very significant for a more limited number of people. So that's a general interest question. But there is a second point, which I think is really important, and this is to do with the history of the natural sciences. Because back in the 17th century here in England, as well as in Germany and Italy, there was a real movement called natural philosophy. And very often in histories of natural science, this is reinterpreted to mean an older way of talking about the natural sciences. But actually, it's not. Natural philosophy is something that's quite different. And I want to talk about that. For example, Isaac Newton's very famous book, The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, actually is not simply about how our world functions, but something much deeper than this. It is, in effect, what does this mean? What is the value of the human interaction with nature? And the third point is that actually this question can also be extended to other interdisciplinary conversations. In other words, although I'll be exploring kind of the barrier or the interaction between science and religion, what I'm going to be saying can easily be extended to include, for example, the relation of science and philosophy and many other disciplines. So if you like, I'm developing a general toolkit which you will be able to use for each of your particular interests. So why does this question interest so many people? Well, one of the reasons is the rise of the movement we now call the New Atheism in the late 2000s. People like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris or Daniel Dennett really generated a very dynamic, a very aggressive discussion of the relation of science and faith. And to begin with, this was seen as very critical of faith, but as people began to explore this in more detail, I think the mood changed. And certainly in the last 5 or 10 years, there's been a growing interest in the positive aspects of the relation of science and religion. And one of the reasons for this is the scholarly dismantling or the discrediting of the warfare narrative for the relation of science and faith. And this took place during the 1990s, but I think we're all aware that scholarly developments do take a long time to filter through to the wider culture. And today I think we'd say something like this, that science and religion are different, but they're not incompatible for that reason. And so many scientists who have religious interests want to find a way of holding these together, or indeed perhaps even integrating them, as the title of this lecture suggests. So the point is, this is, I think, something that's personally significant for some people, but I want to say it's intellectually interesting for a lot of people because the ideas are so interesting. So basically what I want to do is now move on to the second point, which is to look at this whole idea of natural philosophy. Now, natural philosophy is very often simply thought of as an older way of thinking about or describing the natural sciences. But I think we now see this in a very different way. Historians, again, have been very active, and we now know a lot more about natural philosophy. And it's more than just what we would now call natural science. It's not just learning about how nature functioned. It's also learning about what it is we can gain from the study of nature. In other words, can we learn from nature, not simply learn about nature? And that's a very important point, because we're living in an age of environmental change and real anxieties about what is happening with our environment, and the idea that somehow natural philosophy is able to encourage us to respect the natural order, not simply to exploit it, but to understand it, but to foster a right relationship with the natural world and live well within it. So natural philosophy, if you like, does combine two elements, one of which is there in today's natural sciences, and that is understanding how our natural world functions. But natural philosophy is also about understanding how we can foster a right relationship with the natural world and live well within it. And that seems to me to be a very important theme that often gets neglected or sidelined, and maybe a more integrated way of thinking about the relation of science and faith might actually be a way of beginning to do something about this. It's about combining the explanation and the interpretation of nature. But also, I think this is a very important point to make. What I'm going to talk about in this lecture is a general method, a way of thinking about this, a way of imagining reality. And I want to say this can be extended to other interdisciplinary conversations. And of course, there is growing interest today in the academy in trying to encourage dialogue across disciplinary boundaries. And certainly here at Oxford, for example, the relation of medicine and spirituality in promoting human resilience and well-being is a very well-established topic. And again, you can see that this is neither medicine nor religion. It's kind of exploring an interface, but it requires knowledge of both and a willingness to talk about both in a given group of scholars. So this seems to me to be a very important area. We might think, for example, of the relation of science and ethics, which was very important for Albert Einstein. But really, if we're going to do this kind of thing, to have these really interesting conversations, then we need a big picture or an integrated worldview if we're going to be able to do this. And that really brings me to the main topic of this lecture, which is how we do this. Let's look at Edward Wilson, a very interesting writer, well-known American sociobiologist, author of the book Consilience, The Unity of Knowledge. And Edward Wilson says we need to recapture the Renaissance vision of the polymath. In other words, trying to encourage conversations across disciplinary boundaries. And he makes a very interesting point, which I'm going to quote. We are drowning in information while starving for wisdom. The world henceforth will be run by synthesizers, people able to put together the right information at the right time, think critically about it, and make the important choices wisely. Look at that word, synthesizers. That means somebody who feels conversant in two disciplines, who's able to make connections, not necessarily a single individual, but perhaps groups of people. But the key point is we need an intellectual framework to bring about this synthesis and understand how it can be applied more widely. And that's what I want to talk about in this lecture. How can we go about doing this? And there's a problem here. I think the first obvious one is what we might call disciplinary exclusivism. And you can understand this. It's someone who says, look, my own discipline answers all legitimate questions. We don't need anything else. Well, I can respect that. But the point I want to make here is that really it helps to be able to have these conversations which enrich our understanding of other people's disciplines and help us to have conversations with them to enable us to understand them and them to understand us. It's a kind of win-win situation. It's all about beginning to communicate our insights to other disciplines and seeing if there's anything in other disciplines that might help us. And we might think, instead of a discipline disciplinary exclusivism of a spectrum of knowledge of beliefs like science or culture or ethics or religions or political philosophies. These are all important to us. And the key point is, do we simply say there is a plurality of insights and we learn to live with this? Or is there some way of trying to find a way of coordinating or integrating this variety of insights? And in many ways, that's the approach I'm suggesting in this lecture, that we find some way of beginning to bring together and hold together the insights from multiple disciplines, from chemistry or physics or mathematics and religious disciplines, or perhaps philosophy as well. The key point is this gives us a richer and deeper understanding of disciplines and our worlds. Now, in this lecture, I'm going to interact with the British public philosopher Mary Midgley. Some of you will have heard of her, others not, but she offers us a very helpful way of approaching these issues. She talks about an idea of confederated knowledge arising through different realms of human knowledge production. In other words, it's not an imperialist approach saying there's one way of doing this only. It's rather a confederated way, different territories of knowledge speaking to each other, each from their own strengths, but willing to talk to each other and learn from each other. And that's a kind of model I'm going to be encouraging in this lecture. There is Mary Midgley. She's a rather formidable lady, sadly now dead, but I enjoyed interacting with her many times during her lifetime. And here's a quotation which I think is very helpful in thinking about this question. For most important questions in human life, she says, a number of different conceptual toolboxes always have to be used together. In other words, one discipline on its own isn't good enough. We need to respect each discipline, but find a way of bringing them together and integrating or weaving together the insights that they offer. And Midgley uses the image of multiple maps. Again, multiple maps. And here she channels a British physicist who was very interested in these questions, and that's John Zeeman. And Midgley argues as follows. Zeeman developed a metaphor of knowledge as a group of maps, not of one map, but of a collection of maps, all of them incomplete, which together gradually shape our understanding of a new piece of country. And by bringing those maps together and constantly improving them, he said, in time we build up a composite picture, which brings us closer and closer to what the outside world is actually telling us. So the image, the imaginative framework is maps. We need multiple maps to represent and understand a complex reality. And what we need to do is to bring these together. So Midgley herself says this. On the one hand, I want to emphasize that there is only one world, but also on the other, that this one world is so complex, so various, that we need dozens of different distinct thought patterns to understand it. We simply can't reduce these ways of thinking to any single model. Instead, we have to use our philosophical tools to bring these distinct kinds of thought together. So her motivation here is to integrate, to respect each discipline, but to find a way of trying to give us a bigger picture than any one of them can offer individually. So our argument is this: no map shows everything. Each map concentrates on answering a particular set of questions. Each map explains the whole only in the sense of answering certain given questions about it, not others. Each set of questions arises out of its own particular background in life, out of its own specific set of problems, and need answers relevant to those problems. So you see the point Midgley is making. There is only one world, but it's a big one. And we need many maps to do justice to its scope and its range, and to the interests and concerns of its inhabitants. So where does Midgley take us? Well, I think she takes us in some very good directions. First of all, she has this image of knowledge not being an empire with an authoritative center. It's about free trading between confederated yet distinct domains of thought. That, I think, is very helpful to thinking about the relationship of scientific worldviews to other ways of thinking about our world. It respects the science, but says, let's talk and bring other voices into this conversation. And we, I think, also to respect the limits of maps. And this is a well-known Latin American writer. So he wrote a very famous short essay on exactitude in science. And his basic argument is simply this: maps offer a reduced account of reality, and that means that no map is going ever to be able to do justice to the fullness of our world. I think that's a simple point, that in dealing with the image of the map, let's respect its limitations, but at the same time, let's recognize how useful it is. It's about superimposing different maps, a physical map, a biological map, a philosophical map, a theological map, a political map, an ethical map, and realize that when we do this, we get a deeper and richer vision of our world. It does not in any way disrespect or devalue any discipline, especially in the sciences. It simply says, let's find a way of talking to and thinking about this with other disciplines. So we just have to learn to live, I think, with the problem of a complex reality which is resistant to reductionism. But that is something that I think we have to learn to live with, and we can do that. Now, of course, many will say, well, this all sounds very interesting, but, we want to be persuaded there are some benefits in doing this. You may have persuaded us it might be interesting. You may have persuaded us that this image of multiple maps is actually a viable way ahead. But what benefits result from this? And I think that's a very fair question. But I want to make the point that really we do this all the time. We've become very good at making connections across disciplines and boundaries all the time. And the sociologist Christian Smith has simply said that actually this seems to be a characteristic of human beings, that we use multiple and very often inconsistent narratives or conceptual frameworks to make sense of our social, our scientific, political, and religious worlds. In other words, we just do this all the time, very often without thinking about it. So I think it is helpful to begin to think about what we're doing and to try and ask what benefits result from doing the kind of interdisciplinary conversations that I've been encouraging in this lecture. I think the core point I'm going to begin by making is this: that human beings need a wider knowledge base than any single discipline can provide. And in many ways, this limitation is a result of what we would now call disciplinary fragmentation. If we go back to the time of the Renaissance, we find a much more broad vision of human knowledge. We don't have this fragmentation of disciplines into individual scientific disciplines and then individual scientific sub-disciplines. There's an attempt really to try and hold together a wide variety of knowledge. I think one of the points I want to make here is that a general point is that science is very, very good at offering us explanations of reality. But actually, we need something more than this. We need interpretations of reality. What is the significance of reality to human existence? And that's a very important question, I think. So we take this well-known Spanish philosopher, José Ortega y Gasset. He argues that if, as human beings, we are going to lead fulfilled lives, then we need more than the partial account of reality that science is able to offer us. And there's nothing wrong with science, it's just science, and we need to expand the vision that we're able to work with if we're going to be able to deal with some of these really important questions. He argues that if we're going to need fulfilled lives, we need a bigger picture, an integral idea of the universe. And this is something that we need to be able to put together. It's not something that's naturally given to us. It's something we've got to construct. We need an intellectual framework. We need what Charles Taylor calls a social imaginary to make sense of what we're looking at. And we find a similar idea in the well-known philosopher of science, Karl Popper, who used the phrase ultimate questions to try and explain the idea that science isn't really able to answer some of the deepest questions that lie at the heart of human existence, about the riddle of existence or about man's task in this world. And these are ultimate questions about meaning or purpose or value. And Popper argues these just cannot be properly answered by the natural sciences. But that, he insists, does not mean that they are unanswerable. We need to develop an intellectual framework that helps us to answer these questions. He writes, the fact that science cannot make any pronouncement about ethical principles has been misinterpreted as indicating that there are no such principles. And clearly that's something that we want to look at and challenge. So again, coming back to José Ortega y Gasset, the argument is that scientific truth is characterized by its precision, by the certainty of its predictions. There's the Spanish text. But his argument is that this estimable, admirable quality of science is won at a cost. That in effect this means that we simply remain on the level of secondary problems, and we aren't able to touch ultimate or decisive questions. And the issue is, how can we do this? How can we make sure that science is involved in these very important conversations about ultimate questions when science is not able to answer them? And here, of course, we're picking up on a theme developed by the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who really argued that the transition from fact to value, so important in human moral reflections, is something that science is unable to make on its own. So how might we find help here? Well, this is where we begin to think about the nature of religion and how it actually begins to engage with some of the questions we're thinking about in talking about developing an integrated way of thinking about science and religion, or indeed science and the humanities. This is Robert Emmons, an empirical psychologist, and the point he's making in this really important intervention about the psychology of ultimate concerns is simply this. Empirical psychology shows us that we need more than purely empirical answers to life's questions. We need to be engaged with something deeper. Religion, he argues, can provide us with a comprehensive and integrated framework of meaning that helps us to explore many worldly events, experiences, and situations, while providing a way of helping individuals to transcend their own concerns or experience and connect up with something greater. Now, I think you can see what he is talking about here. He's making a very important point, that an empirical account of human beings, what we think is important, what we feel is valuable, what we feel is essential to existential well-being, means we need to engage certain questions, which natural sciences on their own aren't able to answer. But here's my point. I want natural sciences to be in this conversation. And that means we need to build a bigger framework which allows us to bring these insights into the conversation. This philosopher Keith Yandell, again talking about religion and life and making a very similar problem. He's saying we need some kind of conceptual system, some way of thinking about things which enables us to bring together things. He writes, a religion is a conceptual system that provides an interpretation of the world and the place of human beings in it. It bases an account of how life should be lived given that interpretation, and expresses that interpretation and lifestyle in a set of rituals, institutions, and practices. And Yandell says this is his neutral description of religion, but his key point is, look at the importance of the theme of integration. It's about bringing things together, allowing us to see how we as human beings can hold these ideas together in our thinking about the nature of life and the way in which we live our lives in the world. And Yandell's point, I think, brings home to us something really quite important. It's well established that moral values are really important for human beings. It's well established that meaning is really important for human beings. And the key point that Yandell is making is these don't just happen. They're not things we can observe in our world. They're rather things we construct. They're things that emerge from a worldview, that emerge from an interpretation of our world. And therefore we need to find a way, I think, of holding together both the natural sciences, which are so good at engaging our world and helping us to understand how our world functions, with ways of thinking that try to interpret the world so we can see how we as human beings fit into this world meaningfully and are able to flourish and live well in it. And again, we don't really want to lose contact with disciplines like the natural sciences because we feel it's important to try and bring these insights into this bigger conversation about what this world's all about, what we as human beings mean, and how we achieve a sort of viable way of existing in the world today. Now, Albert Einstein, a well-known natural scientist, who was the very first natural science I really studied at Oxford, was very, very clear. Look, science really matters. It's really important, but we have to learn to live with its limits. And this is from Einstein's very famous lecture on science and religion given at Princeton in 1939. And what I want you to notice is how he's really saying science matters. It really is important, but it does have its limits. We've got to figure out a way of, in effect, recognizing those limits and finding ways of ensuring scientific insights get into these really important conversations about ethics and values and the meaning of life. Here's what he says. The scientific method can teach us nothing else beyond how facts are related to and conditioned by each other. Then he makes the point that the aspiration towards objective knowledge clearly is one of the highest things of which we as human beings are capable. But here's the really important point he makes. I quote, "It's clear that knowledge of what is does not open the door directly to what should be. One can have the clearest and most complete knowledge of what is, and yet not be able to deduce from that what should be the goal of our human aspirations." That seems to me to be very important because it brings us to what we might call the big questions that we have to think about in life. And one of them clearly is, what is the point of life? In other words, is there meaning to life? Or why are we here? Are we just here? Or in effect, is there a reason for this? And the discovery of this reason for this, in effect, gives us a new insight into who we are, why we really matter, what we are meant to be doing. Or again, a really important point for a lot of people. Is my life meaningful? And as you will know, that's a terribly important question in today's when psychological well-being is increasingly recognized as being so important to human existence, and particularly in universities here in the United Kingdom, growing recognition of the fact that so many students do not find life meaningful is seen as being part of the concern relating to the difficulties we're experiencing with younger people in our society. And psychological research, I think, makes it very, very clear how important it is to be able to answer these human questions if we're going to encourage human well-being and flourishing. But the point is that we need a theory of everything that matters if we're going to be able to give answers to these questions. And so that's why in this lecture I'm really emphasizing we need scientific voices in these very important conversations about meaning, about value, about significance, because it's such an important topic and the natural sciences are so important. And we need to find a way of bringing them into this conversation, respecting disciplinary integrity, but at the same time recognizing disciplinary limitations. So let's begin to look at this in more detail. Let's look at Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson is a very interesting Canadian psychologist, and he tries to answer these questions at both the academic and the popular level. So here we are, the 1999 book, Maps of Meaning, which I studied some years ago. It's a very good academic analysis of the problem of meaning in human existence and gives us a sense of how we might be able to understand why human beings find the acquisition of meaning to be so important. But if you look at the second book, I'm sure you can see on the screen that above the title of the book, over 10 million copies sold. What does that tell us? Well, I think it tells us many things, but one of them is that actually in this book, Jordan Peterson is asking questions people are really asking. He's talking about deeply significant questions and trying to answer them. Maybe he doesn't answer them completely. Maybe the issues need to be revised and revisited. But the key point is how important these questions are for so many people. And that's why I think Jordan Peterson's analysis is very significant, even though, as I think many of us would agree, there is more that needs to be said. So the key point is that Jordan Peterson is someone who has moved from the academic sector, maps of meaning, to, in effect, popular engagement. He's now, I think, one of the most influential public intellectuals in the Western world in his 2018 book, 12 Rules for Life. So I think these are really important questions. So let's look at an atheist philosopher, also a natural scientist, Alex Rosenberg. And Rosenberg is a very clear writer. He's a very influential advocate for the view that science is our exclusive guide to reality. And that's a view that we would sometimes refer to as scientism today. So let's look at what Rosenberg has to say. And what I'm going to do, if I may, is look at Rosenberg's 2011 book, The Atheist's Guide to Reality, with the subtitle, Enjoying Life Without Illusions. And in the opening chapter of this book, Rosenberg goes through a number of major questions and gives us an answer from his own perspective. And here is one of those questions. What is the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? I'm sure you'd agree with me, that is really a very important question, and one that actually does need answers. I mean, if we look at our world today, I think trying to answer those questions is really very, very significant. And so I'm sure many of you will be glad to know what Alex Rosenberg's answer is to those questions. And here is his answer to those questions. There is no moral difference between them. Now, I want to step in here and justify what Rosenberg is saying. Rosenberg is saying if science is our exclusive guide to reality, then we simply do not have the intellectual toolkit to be able to make a distinction between right and wrong, good and bad. So Rosenberg is just being entirely consistent, he's saying within this way of thinking, within this set of intellectual norms, there has to be only one answer to this question, and that there is no intellectual basis for allowing a moral difference between right and wrong. So I think, I want to defend Rosenberg here, but I also want to make the point. For many people listening to me, you will say this is a very inadequate answer. We need a much better answer than this if we're going to live meaningfully in our world. And that, I think, is a very important point. Mary Midgley is rather skeptical of this movement called scientism, and she says scientism's mistake doesn't lie in overpraising certain forms of knowledge, but rather in cutting this off from the rest of thought and treating scientism as a victor who's put all the rest out of business. I think that is an important point, because to me, Rosenberg's analysis shows us the need to recognize that we need more than a purely scientific approach to our world. That in effect, we need more than science is able to tell us, not as a criticism of science, but simply saying because science is science, we need to bring other ways of thinking into our discussion of these deep questions. And Mrs. concern is that scientism in effect treats one perspective on the world as being the only valid perspective on things. Let's come back then to the question of the importance of meaning in life. I think that's a very important point. As many of you will know, the anthropologist Clifford Geertz suggests that human beings are meaning-seeking animals. And we just can't live in a world that we are unable to understand. In other words, we need an interpretation of the world if we're going to be able to live meaningfully within it. And that seems to me again to say, look, science is really important, but we need to supplement this, to enrich this through conversations and reflections, or perhaps constructing a bigger way of thinking within which science is fully represented, but other ways of thinking are woven into the conversation. And one of the points that Goethe makes is that nobody's really sure why it is that human beings find the concept of meaning to be so important. But what we do know empirically is that human beings seem to flourish when we have it and wither when we don't. It seems to be part of who we are as human beings. So let's look at Jeanette Winson. Jeanette Winson is a very famous British novelist. She's great fun. I enjoy her writings. But she also reflects on deep questions. And this is Winson reflecting on, in effect, the fact that we are meaning-seeking creatures. And she wants to reflect on that in her books. Very often she's thinking about why it is that there's these deep questions that science can't answer, but we feel we need answers to them. She writes this: the Western world has done away with religion, but not with religious impulses. We seem to need some higher purpose, some point to our lives. Money and leisure, social progress are just not enough. Now, the point she's making there, I think, is really very interesting and very important. Because if we look at several standard studies of meaning, I put two of them on the screen, we see themes like existential mattering, or again, going down, the importance of coherence, purpose, and existential mattering. And what I'm saying simply is that empirical investigation of what human beings seem to feel they need to cope with life regularly identifies certain core questions, certain big questions, as being really important to human beings. And the question is, how can we engage these questions using the richest range of resources that we have at our disposal? From what I've said already in this section, you'll see that religion is clearly very good at answering questions about coherence, purpose, and existential mattering. If you like, those are core concerns of religious or theological reflections. But I think it's important that we bring scientific reflections into these. So that's why I want to wrap up this lecture by, in effect, simply saying how important these things are. I'm going to end this lecture by reflecting on the front of Time magazine for July 1946. And many of you will know this image very, very well. It's a picture of Albert Einstein, looking very reflective and contemplative. And in the background, there is a mushroom cloud beginning to form. And it's a very good way, I think, of beginning to reflect on why this is, I think, a very important question. Einstein, in many ways, is a classic example of a leading scientist who's saying, I love science, it's wonderful, but we need a bigger picture of things than science can offer us on our own if we're going to live meaningfully in this complicated world and try and address its problems. And one of Einstein's concerns was this: science really needs ethics. And this was brought home to him by the way in which his own scientific research was used. He wasn't involved in the Manhattan Project, which developed the first atomic bombs, but he was deeply concerned about the way in which science was being used and felt that we needed to make sure that science was able to be brought into dialogue with ethics, even though science itself was not able to generate ethical values. I think that's a very important point. Earlier I mentioned that the Scottish philosopher David Hume was very, very clear that we simply cannot, and from a purely scientific perspective, generate ethical values. We either have to say, look, we just can't do this, or we introduce intermediary or bridging theories which allow us to make a connection between science and ethics. But these bridging theories are neither scientific nor empirical. So we've got to find a way of constructing a way of thinking, a worldview, a big picture, a theory, which allows us to, in effect, bring science into conversation with ethical reflections while maintaining disciplinary integrity. And the point I want to make here simply is this. Einstein, you can see this equation E equals mc squared on that mushroom cloud. Einstein became increasingly convinced as he got older that there's a need to bring together science, religion, ethics, spirituality, politics, to try and not simply make sense of our world, but enable the preservation of our world while maintaining disciplinary integrity. And in many ways, that is the core concern of this lecture. I want to maintain disciplinary integrity. I want science to be science, but I want scientists to talk to other people. And I want other people to listen to scientists. We need, if you like, a round table. We need an integrated world. We need something that's going to help us to have these conversations, which I believe can be enriching and important. There can be a framework for dialogue. Or maybe, as the title of this lecture playfully suggested, an integrated worldview. Now listen, there's an awful lot more that needs to be said, but I'm looking forward very much to interacting with my dialogue partners and then to seeing where we go with this. I'm delighted to be part of this very significant conversation about scientific worldviews and where we take them. And I hope that I've opened up some interesting possibilities for conversation and look forward to continuing these conversations in the future. Thank you so much for listening.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todos. Gracias, Sofía, por la presentación. Gracias a la comisión organizadora por invitarme a este impresionante seminario. Todavía no puedo creer la convocatoria, así que felicitaciones al comité organizador. Con la idea de que el doctor McGrath iba a estar con nosotros hoy día, yo preparé un comentario en inglés y supe hace poco nomás que no iba a estar. Así que bueno, es lo que voy a presentar a ustedes, con la esperanza que se nos permita tener un breve diálogo después, si es que el tiempo lo permite. Bueno, an integrated view of reality has long been a cherished aspiration in intellectual circles. The standpoints in this regard from José Ortega y Gasset, Jorge Luis Borges, Karl Popper, and Albert Einstein, presented to us by Professor Alister McGrath, are quite eloquent. And of course, we heard many more examples of this human effort throughout the day. The key question is how to achieve this noble objective, taking into account the disciplinary barriers and the ample spectrum of knowledge and beliefs. One possible approach, introduced to us by Professor McGrath, is Mary Midgley's postulate of confederated, though distinct, realms of human knowledge production, which builds on the idea of a collection of maps of knowledge advanced by physicist John Simon. I tend to sympathize with Midgley's proposal because it admits the epistemological limitations of the different realms of knowledge, in the sense that each map answers certain questions but not others. I also appreciate her approach because it emphasizes the fundamental role of philosophy in bringing these distinct kinds of thoughts together. I would like to focus on a possible way of interaction between two realms or two maps or two domains of knowledge, namely science and religion, which are also two fundamental pillars of human culture. While science leads us into the unveiling of the logic of nature, religion contributes to the overall picture by guiding us into the meaning of the various advancements of science. And I am sure that you noticed that Professor McGrath insisted several times on the importance of looking for the meaning of the findings of science. Thus, this is an exercise that seeks to project scientific knowledge into a dimension that reaches beyond the experimental method. In addition, a fruitful dialogue between science and religion would be expected to facilitate interpretations of reality as well as to deal with the ultimate questions such as those posed by Professor McGrath. This search for unity of knowledge through this dialogue, in which philosophy and theology play an essential role, is a very genuine concern of man, since the world is presented to him as a whole. The philosophical disciplines, especially philosophy of nature, and even metaphysics, further extend our understanding of reality without necessarily appealing to religious faith. One would hope that such dialogue between science and religion would be a common practice, at least in academic institutions. However, we must bear in mind that many scholars and vast segments of educated society consider science by itself as the summit of knowledge. For these representatives of scientism, there appears to be scientific arguments to explain all sorts of events and phenomena, including the origin of the universe or even the origin of human consciousness. To many, the world needs no explanation beyond research-based evidence, even less of a divine being responsible for its creation and its subsequent unfolding. Occasionally, influential leaders of scientism are not only hostile towards the religion, but they disqualify religious people as being prejudiced, short-minded, and intolerant. And there are various examples of this type of attitude. This arrogant attitude, which is not exclusive of atheistic scientists, has its origin in an underlying epistemological error, which is the misunderstanding of the scope of each area of knowledge. Thus, by indistinctly mixing science with philosophy, it pretends to attain, quote-unquote, scientific evidence about the non-existence of God or his non-attendance in natural processes. This is why it is so common to find prestigious scientists stating, for example, that if we succeed someday in creating a simple organism in the laboratory, this will serve as a proof that a superior being had nothing to do with the origin of life in the primitive Earth. Or others who claim that Darwinian natural selection suffices to account for the apparent design observed in nature, accepting the participation of a supernatural agent conducting the process. But there is another threat to a dialogue between science and religion which is as dangerous as plain scientism. It consists in a sort of spiritual attitude underlying the conviction that the biblical text is to be interpreted by its literal meaning, leaving no room for arguments based on reason or in scientific evidence. I have personally had the chance to meet several representatives of this doctrine, and I have always been impressed by their intellectual honesty and the strength in their beliefs. Science has a universal discourse, whereas different traditions and sources of inspiration have given rise to several religions. In the case of Catholicism, the one I know best, much can be learned from the legacy of recent popes regarding the richness of the interplay between science and religion. Thus, according to St. John Paul II, I quote, "Science can purify religion from error and superstition, and religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Each can draw the other into a wider world, a world in which both can flourish." End of the quote. In turn, Pope Benedict XVI, throughout his magisterium, dedicated much effort to reflect on the mutual relationship of reason and faith, inviting us over and over again to expand the use of our reason. An irrational faith can decay into fundamentalism and intolerance, he claimed. In turn, if reason dispenses of faith, it can lead to pride and to nihilism. More recently, Pope Francis has highlighted that by stimulating wonder before the profound mystery of creation, faith broadens the horizons of reason to shed greater light on the world which discloses itself to scientific investigation. This dialogue between science and religion must be undertaken with a due respect for the identities of both domains, because they are of different order. This implies knowledge, both scientific and religious, requires independent consideration for the establishment of the bridges of communication offered by philosophy. As mentioned earlier, the role of philosophy in this endeavor is critical, because the science-religion dialogue is implicitly based on some philosophical presuppositions. One of them, which we could classify of an ontological type, is the rationality or intelligibility of nature. We believers know that this world is intelligible because it is the work of a creator who endowed it with certain values and principles of operation. Another assumption, in this case epistemological, stems from the human capacity of knowing and understanding the natural order. As pointed out by the British scientist and theologian William Whewell, our capacity to discover the laws of nature and express them in a logical manner is the best example of the affinity that exists between the human mind and the divine mind. There is also an ethical presupposition, since the search for scientific truth involves values such as rigorousness, objectivity, and honesty. The dialogue between science and religion must be always conducted with confidence in that nothing can be proved by physical science that can contradict the scriptures, since God, the creator and ruler of all things, is also the author of the scriptures. In the end, the fecundity of the dialogue will manifest itself in believers who find novel arguments based on scientific knowledge to strengthen their faith, and in scientists whose faith has expanded the limited horizons offered by the empirical method. Gracias por la atención.
Profesor Velázquez.
Muchas gracias, buenas tardes. Quiero desde luego comenzar agradeciendo la invitación para estar en este evento comentando la intervención del doctor McGrath, que es una referencia mundial sobre el diálogo ciencia-religión, y muy agradecido también por la oportunidad de compartir este espacio con el doctor Vicuña, que es uno de los científicos latinoamericanos más comprometidos con este diálogo. En estos breves minutos lo que voy a hacer es exponer brevemente, de manera muy general, algunas ideas, podrían parecer incluso hasta obviedades, en torno a al concepto de visión integrada que el profesor McGrath ha mencionado, y la relación de esta visión integrada del mundo con la noción de unidad del saber, sobre todo y particularmente en este contexto de pensamiento fragmentado que estamos viviendo hoy en día. Para nadie es una novedad que durante 400 años la modernidad construyó una concepción del mundo resultado de la descripción de las diferentes disciplinas que hacen de la realidad. Pero hoy esa descripción se ha tornado metodológicamente hiperespecializada. Y eso hace muy difícil plantear una visión unificada o una visión global de la realidad. A menos que una disciplina en particular sirva como modelo explicativo del resto del mundo, y mediante un reduccionismo radical llevemos a cabo una unificación metodológica como las muchas que hemos visto a lo largo de estos años y de estos siglos. El mecanicismo, el positivismo, el cerebrocentrismo, etc. Como nos ha recordado el profesor McGrath en su exposición, no hay mapa conceptual posible que sea capaz de englobar toda la información que la hiperespecialización y el conocimiento fragmentado nos aportan hoy sobre la realidad. De hecho, hay quienes piensan que alcanzar un conocimiento global de este tipo solo es posible para un sistema algorítmico de inteligencia artificial que reúna y procese la información sobre el mundo con más capacidad y velocidad que la mente humana. En estas circunstancias, parece entonces conveniente preguntarnos si es posible ir más allá del conocimiento fragmentado y si realmente se puede concebir la realidad como un todo, sin caer en reduccionismos, o si por el contrario estamos condenados a aceptar una visión desarticulada de la realidad y del mundo. Para responder a esta pregunta, considero indispensable que hagamos una discusión conceptual, una distinción conceptual entre conocimiento general y saber universal. Entiendo conocimiento general como la suma holística de todos los conocimientos que las disciplinas aportan acerca de la realidad. Una visión de este tipo es hoy completamente imposible. En cambio, el saber universal es otra cosa. El vocablo universal proviene de la expresión latina unum versus aliud, esto es, lo común no obstante lo diverso. En otras palabras, lo conectivo o transversal que pone en relación realidades diversas de un mismo mundo complejo y dinámico. El conocimiento general resulta de sumar lo que cada disciplina aporta dentro de sus límites metodológicos y fronteras del conocimiento. En cambio, el saber universal en lugar de hablar de límites, fronteras, mapas, reinos o territorios de cada disciplina, considera más bien los horizontes disciplinares. Para hacer más explícita esta distinción, pensemos un momento en lo que es un horizonte. Una línea imaginaria a la que mientras más nos acercamos, más extiende frente a nosotros el amplio entorno que abarca y relaciona, sin fijar un límite o una demarcación, sino más bien proyectándose hacia las muchas direcciones con las que se conecta y engloba. Por eso es que el saber universal, en lugar de enfocarse en los límites de cada disciplina, se concentra en lo común, en lo que conecta los diferentes campos, escenarios y dimensiones de las diferentes áreas del saber. Pero abandonar la pretensión de un conocimiento general, fruto de la hiperespecialización y la fragmentación reduccionista del mundo, para ir hacia el saber universal conectivo, propio del unum versus aliud, de lo común no obstante lo diverso, requiere de una especial actividad intelectual que hoy hemos dado por llamar interdisciplinaridad. La interdisciplinaridad no es solo una actividad de intelecto, sino que es un hábito personal. No es un método de los métodos o una nueva disciplina entre otras disciplinas, sino una actitud por la que nos interesamos en comprender y valorar otras áreas del conocimiento para encontrar respuestas conectivas y comunes a problemas complejos que una disciplina en particular no logra resolver. Para llevar a cabo una interdisciplinaridad efectiva, necesitamos, por tanto, un diálogo en el que abandonemos los formalismos y tecnicismos de nuestra propia área del saber y traduzcamos los resultados de nuestra disciplina al lenguaje de lógica natural, que trate acerca de problemas reales, problemas ontológicos, y que no se enganche exclusivamente en discusiones meramente epistemológicas o conceptuales. Insisto, entender la realidad como un todo universal, requiere de hábitos interdisciplinares conectivos que nos permitan identificar cuándo estamos hablando de datos, cuándo estos datos se vuelven información y cuándo esa información nos da verdadero conocimiento y sabiduría. Algo que los sistemas de control delegado, que hoy llamamos inteligencia artificial, solo pueden imitar, pero no sustituir. La mentalidad interdisciplinar es la única esperanza para comprender la realidad como un todo frente a la visión fragmentada del saber. Así como la realidad aumentada, la llamada realidad aumentada, nos permite hoy entender más didácticamente la complejidad de los fenómenos, así hoy necesitamos de una mentalidad aumentada, que ante la inmensa cantidad de información y de datos que arroja el mundo, sea capaz de pensarlo como un todo conectado, integrado, aunque inestable, dinámico y volátil. Si bien las diferentes disciplinas de conocimiento son hiperespecializadas, y está bien que así lo sean, nuestras inquietudes cognitivas o intelectuales no tienen por qué ser fragmentadas, sino que deben ser más bien conectivas, transversales, complejas. En ese sentido, la universidad como institución cultural resulta un sitio privilegiado para ejercer la interdisciplinaridad. Así nacieron las universidades hace casi 1000 años, preocupadas por la unidad del saber en sentido universal, en el unum versus aliud, un sentido conectivo, transversal, que busca lo común, no obstante lo diferente. La necesidad de una visión global del mundo, de un saber universal, se manifiesta especialmente en torno a la comprensión del ser humano y el sentido de su existencia en este cosmos evolutivo, en esta existencia que habitamos entre otros seres vivos y en donde nuestra inteligencia nos permite crear comunidades sociales y afectivas de coexistencia. Solo mediante la interdisciplina se comprende la realidad humana en todas sus múltiples dimensiones interconectadas, su corporeidad, su espiritualidad, sus criterios éticos, las interacciones sociales, las inquietudes culturales y científicas y otras más. Si en lugar de apostar por un conocimiento interdisciplinar nos quedamos únicamente con la fragmentación hiperespecializada del saber, no será posible elaborar ninguna visión global del mundo como un todo, y corremos el riesgo de que la realidad se nos aparezca cada vez más inconexa, más ininteligible, más absurda. La sola multidisciplina no es suficiente para concebir la realidad como un todo, pues agrupa de manera paralela los diversos conocimientos que aporta cada disciplina, pero no plantea una conexión entre ellos, tal como se lo intenta la interdisciplinaridad. En resumen, para hablar de la realidad como un todo, de modo que podamos conectar lo que las diversas disciplinas describen del mundo, y superemos la fragmentación del conocimiento mediante la unidad del saber, necesitamos adquirir y ejercer hábitos conectivos como los que la interdisciplina ofrece en el contexto de una bien orientada formación universitaria. Estas son pues algunas de las reflexiones que me sugirió la exposición del profesor McGrath y que me pareció pertinente compartir en este contexto. Muchas gracias.
Hablando así realmente de lo que ocurre en sus prácticas docentes o de investigación, ¿en qué instancia ustedes han practicado este diálogo entre ciencia y religión, sobre todo con sus estudiantes?
Bueno, no es un asunto que nazca naturalmente en la clase, en la sala de clases, ¿eh? Pero sí cuando uno va conociendo más los alumnos y se acercan a conversar después de una clase, particularmente cuando se tocan ciertos temas. Por ejemplo, a mí en las clases de bioquímica me tocaba hacer una clase sobre el origen de la vida. Y eso inmediatamente gatilla una inquietud en los estudiantes. Yo no entraba mucho en aspectos que iban más allá de la ciencia para cubrir cómo los científicos están viendo el origen de la vida, pero sí, claro, después de la clase se acercaban algunos alumnos a conversar sobre el tema. No, esto del diálogo, en primer lugar, es un asunto personal que uno tiene, es una inquietud, es la pregunta que uno se hace, ¿no? ¿Cómo concilio la información que me entrega la ciencia con, para los que somos creyentes, la información que me ha sido revelada, en la cual yo creo, pero que no es fácil interpretar? En fin, hay todo ahí un desafío permanente. Y a ver si puedo redondear la pregunta de esta manera, ampliándola. Estoy pensando en cómo las instituciones de educación superior abordan este asunto de la ciencia y la religión, y en esto el profesor Velázquez tiene mucha experiencia también, porque hay varias universidades, al menos en Latinoamérica, y de todas maneras Oxford, donde está el profesor McGrath, me ha tocado, y a Héctor también, visitar el Ian Ramsey Center of Science and Religion, qué sé yo, Berkeley, Cambridge, hay muchas universidades, bueno, la UPAEP en Puebla, en México, que tienen centros de ciencia y religión, porque esas universidades, que no necesariamente son confesionales, han estimado, con la inquietud que nos ha reunido hoy día, convocado hoy día, ¿no es cierto?, que hay que tener una visión más amplia sobre la realidad, que la espiritualidad tiene algo que decir. Entonces han organizado estos grupos interdisciplinarios, varios de ellos con personal full time, y por supuesto en los cuales participan profesores de distintas facultades que tengan ese interés. Aquí en Chile se ven algunos embriones de ese tipo de centros, ojalá que prosperen, y así es como veo yo que se está abordando en las universidades.
Héctor.
Sí, bien, en mi caso, digamos, por la temática que a mí me ha tocado enseñar en estos años, filosofía de la naturaleza, filosofía de la ciencia, quizá temáticamente es más natural que a veces salgan estas cuestiones, pero creo que es fundamental, además de lo que temáticamente salga en clase o en la investigación, es importante, creo, fomentar que no haya preguntas prohibidas. La cultura contemporánea que heredó el neopositivismo, que heredó positivismos anteriores, se hizo muy permeable a preguntas prohibidas. Hay cosas que no se deben tocar, hay cosas que no deben inquietar al ser humano, hay cosas que tenemos muy claras y definitivas, y eso genera que las dimensiones más allá del mundo natural, como la dimensión espiritual o las inquietudes más profundas humanas, a veces no salgan a colación y el ser humano tenga la idea de que no son temas que sean planteables. En México, de donde yo vengo, alguna vez la UNAM, la Universidad Nacional, hizo un estudio en la Facultad de Ciencias de por qué cada vez había menos alumnos de ciencias, y lo que resultó fue que en la educación anterior, en el bachillerato, en la escuela media, se suele enseñar la ciencia como algo definitivo, dado, que ya no presenta ningún tipo de desafío, no hay casi nada más que investigar, más bien hay que asimilarlo y comunicarlo. Y esa es una visión de lo que yo llamo preguntas prohibidas, porque entonces el alumno no se siente inquietado a seguir investigando y mucho menos a otras dimensiones del ser humano. Yo creo que es importante en la labor universitaria, filosófica, educativa, superior, intentar que esas preguntas no se acallen, que esas inquietudes no dejen de ventilarse y estar preparados docentes, investigadores y académicos en saber enfrentar inquietudes que la juventud trae de manera natural sobre esos terrenos, ¿no?
Y para ir cerrando, quisiera pedirle a los dos que le hagan una pregunta a su otro comentarista que pueda ser respondida en un tiempo breve. Si quieres, partes tú, Héctor, preguntándole algo a Rafael y luego Rafael.
Héctor sabe la pregunta que le voy a hacer.
Desafortunadamente yo no sé qué preguntarte. A ver.
O un comentario de su ponencia.
Yo creo que, quiero cometer una indiscreción, ya que me pusieron en este tenor. Alguna vez tuve la oportunidad, el privilegio de que Rafael me invitara a una sesión plenaria de la Academia Pontificia de las Ciencias, que fue muy interesante porque estábamos sentados y me decía, mira, ese que está allí es el que descubrió tal cosa, la mitocondria, premio Nobel. Ese que está ahí es el que descubrió el esqueleto de Lucy, el Australopithecus. Una cantidad de gente, además que no estaba ahí Stephen Hawking, pero ese año también fue contigo a ese evento. Y yo quería preguntarte, ese conocimiento de todas esas mentes que están regularmente en las naciones a las que tú asistes en esa academia que tiene tanto premio Nobel y que muchos no son creyentes ni mucho menos, ¿qué enseñanza te deja a ti como científico? Es decir, ¿te da un testimonio exclusivamente personal que pertenece a la esfera particular de cada quien, o te hace a ti ver que la ciencia los ha acercado a preguntas últimas? ¿Qué experiencia te ha dejado a ti la convivencia con esta gente tan destacada en ese lugar?
Bueno, primero que nada señalar, para los que no lo conocen, la gente piensa que la Academia Pontificia de Ciencias está compuesta somos 80 científicos que adhieren a la Iglesia y que en fin, son confesionales, digamos, y para nada, creo que somos 6 o 7 los católicos de los 80. Entonces somos científicos y tratamos materias científicas, y cuando realmente se busca ir más allá de los hallazgos científicos, que son los que se presentan en las ponencias, bueno, es durante el café, durante las comidas, donde tratamos de incursionar en otros temas, y claro, uno se da cuenta que bueno, gente muy sencilla en general. Hay una cantidad muy impresionante de premios Nobel en la Academia, creo que son 30 o 40 de los 80, de modo que como somos de por vida y no van todos a las reuniones porque hay algunos que ya tienen cierta edad que no les permite ir, entonces de los 60 que asisten, al menos la mitad son premios Nobel. Es una cosa muy impresionante, y bueno, son gente muy razonable, muy abierta, muy sencilla, inquieta intelectualmente, así que ha sido un privilegio tremendo poder interactuar con esa gente. Y perdonen la cita personal, pero algo dijiste tú. Hay tantos premios Nobel de biología y de bioquímica ahí que me encantaba en mis clases mostrar fotos, las selfies con ellos, ¿no? Porque entonces es eso, una lección de humildad. Uno ve mucha arrogancia en el mundo del conocimiento, pero también ve mucha humildad y extraordinariamente de las personas que tienen mayores razones para no ser tan humildes. Esa ha sido una experiencia extraordinaria.
¿Y tu breve pregunta para Héctor?
No, yo no te voy a preguntar lo que es el ser, porque me encanta cuando me encuentro con Héctor decir, ya pues Héctor, explícame lo que es el ser.
No te daría el tiempo para responderlo en todo caso.
No, te quiero preguntar, Héctor, a ver si puedes elaborar un poco una cosa que me hizo ella a mí cuando se lo oí a nuestro amigo Bill Carroll la primera vez, que es lo siguiente, ¿no es cierto? Los científicos trabajamos con evidencia experimental. Eso es lo que tenemos que hacer. Y desde San Alberto Magno para adelante aprendemos que no hay que tener una actitud como, mira qué milagroso. No hay milagros, hay que hacer investigación científica. Y yo adhiero a eso y me carga esto del Dios de los agujeros, etcétera, tapa agujeros. Pero al mismo tiempo me doy cuenta que la capacidad de la ciencia para conocer la realidad es limitada, no me entrega todas las respuestas. Y ahí está el desafío, y por algo un seminario como este hoy día. Entonces ahí está el rol de la filosofía. Y cuando yo converso esto con colegas, no sé por qué existe la idea de que meterse en filosofía es ir a lo sobrenatural. Y bueno, yo no lo veo así, o sea, el pensamiento filosófico lo veo como una herramienta fundamental para tratar de comprender todo, pero eso es cierto que nos facilita una proyección hacia la espiritualidad, si tú quieres, o hacia la religión, nos facilita, pero no necesariamente. Entonces, me encuentro yo, como decía, con cierta reticencia de los científicos a introducirse un poquito en la filosofía de la naturaleza y en la metafísica, porque creen que eso es como una prédica para que se hagan religiosos. Entonces, a mí me interesaría mucho que tú como filósofo nos dijeras cuán fuerte este argumento mío, digamos, de que uno puede tranquilamente navegar por la filosofía siendo ateo y buscando las explicaciones sin tener que recurrir a la dimensión religiosa.
Y en un minuto la respuesta.
En un minuto. Sí. Bueno, yo creo que es importante para la filosofía lo que se conoce como la subalternancia de los saberes, es decir, la capacidad de distinguir de acuerdo a los principios o fundamentos que la realidad nos muestra, qué saber va primero, qué saber va después, de cuál obtenemos qué información, de cuál qué otra, para no caer en reduccionismos. Y entonces eso hace que de una manera muy natural los saberes se intersecten. Hay que reconocer y hay que hacer un juicio crítico que la filosofía de los últimos 150 años abandonó las preguntas importantes de la realidad. Se convirtió en necrología del conocimiento, se convirtió en una revisión por una intención de parecer un saber riguroso y ordenado, etcétera. Se hizo historiografía, o en el peor de los casos, filología, no porque la filología sea mala, sino porque tiene su propio campo. Y las preguntas importantes sobre los orígenes, sobre el fundamento del ser, sobre qué nos hace humanos, qué nos distingue de otros seres vivos, cuál es la diferencia entre Big Bang y origen radical de la realidad. Todas esas preguntas las plantearon los científicos en el siglo XX. Entonces, afortunadamente, la filosofía de la naturaleza, que es la disciplina que quizá peor mercado ha tenido en los últimos 300 años, ha tenido un renacimiento gracias a las inquietudes sobre todo de cosmólogos, de biólogos, de bioquímicos, de evolucionistas, que han traído otra vez a la mesa problemas que ellos se dan cuenta que su propia área no puede resolver de todo, pero que intersectan con inquietudes que son de otro orden. Y ahí entra el diálogo filosófico más natural, menos acartonado, que el que se ha implantado desde la escolaridad, que ha hecho la filosofía muchas veces un conocimiento críptico para iniciados, que no es lo que normalmente la gente espera de una idea filosófica para que un poco ilumine el resto del saber. Entonces yo creo que estamos en un momento muy afortunado en ese sentido, interdisciplinar, culturalmente interdisciplinar, que me tiene a mí muy, muy optimista, de recuperar esa interacción entre disciplinas científicas y humanas, sobre todo con ocasión de la tecnología y otros saberes, que nos ponen en común retos que convocan ambos, ¿no?
Muchísimas gracias, un gran aplauso para nuestros panelistas.